From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the Iran talks in Vienna. These high-level talks, now in their fifth week, are aimed at reviving the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that President Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. from in mid-2018. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got three great guests with us on the program today to help us make sense of things. Alex Vatanka, Abdolrasool Divsallar, and Michael Eisenstadt. Alex is the head of MEI's Iran program, a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative, and the author of the just-released book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, which explores the internal policy process in Tehran by following two key regime personalities, Ali Khamenei and Akbar Rafsanjani. Abdolrasool is an expert on Iran's foreign and defense policy. He co-leads the Regional Security Initiative at the Middle East Directions Program of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. He's also an adjunct professor at the Catholic University in Milan. Michael is the Kahn Fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies program, a specialist in Persian Gulf and Arab-Israeli security affairs. He's published widely on irregular and conventional warfare and nuclear weapons proliferation in the Middle East. Alex, Abdolrasool, Mike, thank you for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alex, let's start with you. The Vienna talks have been going on for 5 weeks now, with the fourth and latest round of negotiations kicking off on May 7th. Where do things stand?
Alistair, obviously none of us are at Vienna to follow these talks. So unfortunately, we have to sit back and just try and figure out what we can make out of the signs that are coming out. But to me, clearly, all the signs suggest that the broad framework that will allow the United States to rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal are seemingly falling into place. And I emphasize the broader framework. I'm sure there'll be lots of issues that will keep dividing the negotiating parties. But really, at this point, it seems the question is about timing of announcing that what was left of the 2015 deal has been rescued, if you will. I think sitting here in Washington, you hear a lot from the Biden administration about, the deal is still only a hypothetical, that there's a lot of hard work ahead. I'm sure there's hard work ahead, but I think when people talk about a hypothetical, i.e. we don't know if a deal can be reached yet, is somewhat disingenuous because I think the Biden administration really wants to revive this deal. And I think they speak in the sort of, if you will, cautious language because they know they have a huge political fight here in Washington ahead of them. In other words, one set of headaches to overcome are negotiating with the Iranians in Vienna, but the Biden team already are preparing the ground for the political fight here in Washington to sort of justify what they're seemingly willing to give away to Iran in terms of sanctions relief and so forth.
Abdolrasool, from what you can tell, how far apart are the two sides and what are the kind of key issues or points of contention at this stage?
Well, Alistair, that's a good question. I think there are couples. The most important one from American side, at least, is the Iran's advancement in post-2019 nuclear issues. I mean, basically, the more advanced IR-4 and IR-6 centrifuges. Well, Iran now have a larger stockpile of over almost 3 tons of enriched uranium. And the experience of Iranians now with 60% highly enriched uranium, which is quite an issue here. So, I mean, how these parts, which are basically under R&D issue, should be dealt with is a key concern. But on the other side, for Iranians, I mean, the issue is more on the sanction things, which is quite, again, a complex issue because of basically the structure of the U.S. sanction on Iran, which is, the Trump administration was quite skillful in doing and mixing sanctions on different labels from nuclear to terrorism to human rights issues. So that makes it very difficult to separate different types of sanctions and make the sanction release a very clear, let's say, things to do. So that's where the complexity emerged from the argument of Iranians that they want a kind of a sanction release which is effective, means that can give them a kind of real economic relief, not just on the paper, but also it makes the American side's argument quite valid in the sense that part of the nuclear advancement that Iran has achieved in post-2019 is quite now difficult to set back. So maybe we are facing with a kind of a less for less deal, but it means that, Iran is now claiming for IRGC sanctions relief, which is a kind of a complex story because of also the number of issues related to the IRGC, but also its share of the Iranian economy that is controlled by IRGC. So these complexities, I think, are still there, and it needs to be addressed.
Mike, let's drill down into the considerations and constraints on both sides here, starting with the U.S. Restoring the JCPOA was something that then candidate Joe Biden campaigned on in the 2020 race. It's been a top priority for the administration, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken about pushing for a quote, longer and stronger accord. What sort of a deal is the White House looking for, and how does that fit into its wider foreign policy approach to the region?
Well, they've talked about compliance for compliance. So, at a very minimum, going back to the 2015 deal, but then, as you mentioned, longer and stronger, pushing back the sunset clauses, strengthening inspections and the like. But the thing is, what we're hearing from the Iranians now is kind of, from their point of view, getting more for less. They would like to, keep some of the centrifuges that they've developed in the interim. This is, of course, from the point of view of the administration, a non-starter. So I'm wondering, actually, if we might be seeing the foundations for a more for more deal here. That the Iranians were very unhappy in 2015 with the degree of sanctions relief that they obtained, that there were still so many sanctions that were on Iran, even after the JCPOA, that it created a business environment which was still, from their point of view, unfavorable, and they weren't able to get all the relief that they were expecting. So they are been asking for, the administration to not only lift the sanctions that were put on related to the JCPOA, but also the Trump sanctions and maybe other stuff that is kind of connected here. Abdolrasool talked about IRGC sanctions. It's really hard to, do business in Iran, because the IRGC is so involved in the economy. So I'm wondering if we might see at least the rudiments of a more for more deal. But that said, I'm skeptical that it'll extend to regional activities or missiles, because from Iran's point of view, these are actually have proven their value and their utility on a day-to-day basis in the last decade, whereas nuclear weapons provide it's an aspirational goal. It's not clear exactly what kind of, other than prestige and influence, what kind of tangible benefits it would provide. Iran's proxy activities, Iran's missile program has provided very tangible benefits. And as a result, I think they'll be loath to give that up. On the other hand, I don't think if the administration cannot get a deal that covers those things, again, this will be seen as a repeat of the 2015 deal, which was seen as insufficient. And there'll be a lot of domestic, I think, opposition in the U.S. to such a deal. So I'm not quite sure, where this goes. Plus, let me just say the fundamental trade-off in the deal that Iran's nuclear program is legitimized, and that in the end of this process, if they go back to the JCPOA or some version of the JCPOA, at the end of the day, they get an industrial scale civilian nuclear program which could be used to provide cover for a clandestine military program. That's not on the table for being renegotiated. So the fundamental flaw of the deal is still in place, and you're just kicking the can down the road and deferring a crisis. So I still think there's a lot of problems, even if you're able to kind of square the circle and get a narrow deal or even a broader deal. It doesn't touch on the fundamental problem, which was at the nub of the critique of the opponents of the JCPOA in the U.S.
Abdolrasool, do you have something you want to add here?
Just a very good point by Michael, which was added. I want to emphasize on that. I mean, maybe another dimension is, I think, is the way that Iranians are pushing now for verification. I mean, the idea comes out from 2016, 2017, that the JCPOA was, according to Iranians, was working on the paper, but in reality, there was not enough investment, and so there was still a lot of banking issues and financial issues. So that's why the Iran is coming up with this idea of verification of the U.S. measures. I mean, basically, that's a complex issue, because when you talk about the verifications of, for example, how sanctions are relieved and how Iranians want to verify that relief of sanctions, it's very much coming to issues of psychological impact of sanctions on private sector and so on, which makes it very difficult to how Iran want to verify it, and makes it very much depending on interpretation of Iranian agents, either from their central bank or whatever other government agencies. So that's again another reason I think that going back even to the normal JCPOA 2015 model is a kind of a difficult task.
If I could just add one more point, however, a lot of the problems related to Iran's ability to, for instance, repatriate funds for oil and attract investment or business is related to the banking system. And the banking system is not transparent. And there's a lot of concerns. There's the Fatah and other international banking organizations that give the Iranian banking system very low grades. And this is a deterrent for Iran's ability to do business. And that's not going to be affected by these negotiations. So I think it's quite possible that even if the U.S. is kind of forward-leaning and meets Iran's demands in this regard, the outcome for Iran will be very unsatisfactory because of their banking system and its involvement in kind of a range of murky activities, smuggling and illegal business practices and stuff like that, which make doing business with Iran very problematic.
Mike, just one follow-up question for you as well, and you kind of touched on this in passing earlier, as did Alex, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. Outside of the White House, how much support is there within Washington more broadly for a renewed deal, especially in Congress?
Well, I think there's kind of almost universal recognition that a deal, some kind of deal, would be desirable. But, I think that's where the agreement ends. And keep in mind that the 2015 deal was heavily criticized. The Congress passed the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which gave them, this part of this was also, the kind of perennial tug of war between the legislative branch and the executive branch over, policy making powers and Congress, ensuring that they have oversight over foreign policy. But they also, they felt they didn't want to be cut out of, having a voice regarding the 2015 deal. And a lot of them thought it was, they were very unhappy with it. So it wasn't very popular to begin with in Washington. And I think there's still, while there's a lot of support for going back to a deal, we've seen kind of a whole, flood of letters by, Congress, persons to the administration, some partisan, some bipartisan, some arguing for going back to the old deal, others saying, no, it has to be something which is longer, stronger, and broader. And I think that's where the majority is right now. And there is bipartisan support, some bipartisan support for a stronger, longer, and broader deal if there is going to be a deal. So this is also going to be, a problematic angle.
Alex, looking at the constraints on the Iranian side, President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif face considerable opposition from other power centers within Tehran, especially the so-called hardliners. How is that impacting the talks? And is it true in your view that, as the Zarif said in the recent leaked recording, that the Revolutionary Guards really call the shots on key issues like this?
Alistair, let me just quickly, before I answer your question, just react to what Abdolrasool and Michael just said. Look, I think, bear in mind that one big difference as well, which needs to be highlighted, is between 2015 and today, United States invested heavily in this project called Maximum Pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And frankly, it failed. It did a lot of damage to Iran. We all know that. But as a policy, it did not make it to the end goal. It didn't bring the Iranians to the table. It didn't make the Iranian nuclear program any smaller or any less efficient. It didn't change Iran's behavior in the region, all the rest of it. So what options do we then have left? We tried diplomacy. We tried maximum pressure. You got the war option, that you go into Iran with force and you dismantle it by force. I don't think that's realistic for the United States. I don't think the Iranians look at that as a realistic policy option for the Biden administration, certainly in the short term. Other states might decide to take action on their own, but I think the Iranians are saying, okay, we can take that. We can take that risk. What I'm saying is a lot of the issues that Michael and Abdolrasool highlighted are true, but in terms of solutions, we are not in a better place today than we were in 2015. In fact, in contrast to 2015, where you could put the military option on the table, we can't really realistically and convincingly do that today. The Iranians aren't buying that. And I think that puts us in a different world. And another thing that Abdolrasool and Michael both seem to agree on is the best thing you can hope for is a short-term tactical agreement, which means what? Which means Iran will be able to export more oil from 1 million barrels a day roughly to China alone. It'll sell about 2.5 million to a number of other countries, Japan, South Korea, India. So it has a little bit more economic diversity. The Iranians like that. What they also could get is they can get their money back to Iran through direct banking to banking channels. That's also a plus. But this is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum, which takes me to your question, Alistair, about the infighting in Tehran. Unfortunately, the Iranian regime has been incapable to come up with a vision where they break themselves free from their isolated position they're in right now. There is, what Zarif leak was really about is a foreign minister, a foreign ministry, and a government of Hassan Rouhani trying to move in the direction of something that looks like a normal country. And in the opposition, they have the Revolutionary Guards, the Office of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and a lot of other interest groups that are aligned with the hardliners who don't want to go down that path. So that's not something Washington can fix or anybody else. That's a fight in Iran because unfortunately for the rest of the world, Iranian leaders tend to think, it seems to me at least, very narrow factional interests. They think about what's good for them in Tehran as opposed to what's good for the Iranian national interest. And until they can overcome that obstacle and that challenge, that test, we just can't expect them to do the types of decisions the world wants Iran to make, which is to say, broaden the nuclear deal. Why are you afraid of broadening the nuclear deal? Why not talk about Syria, Iraq, and Yemen and other issues and other matters that are of concern to Iran's neighbors in the United States and others? Why not do that? Well, the reason why they can't do that is because one dominant faction in Tehran believes if they broaden the conversation, that will be the end of them politically in Tehran. And that is our challenge. And as I said, there are no quick solutions to that here in Washington.
Abdolrasool, I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. The other major domestic consideration on the Iranian side is, of course, the upcoming presidential election next month. How is that affecting things?
That's a good question, but let me before also react a very short reaction to Alex's point. I mean, I 100% agree with Alex that unfortunately we are in a very tough situation, and also the alternative is not there. So maybe the only solution is going to a kind of let's say step-by-step way in order to move forward. I mean, saying that, back to your question, I believe that what is happening in Tehran is a kind of needs to be analyzed in two levels. I mean, on a tactical level, I think yes, the political infights is really a kind of issue between the different fractions to take leverage over each other, and arguing that who is a bad negotiator, who is a better negotiator, and that way they try to boost their own agenda. But on a more strategic scale, I mean, where Khamenei is thinking and how he's analyzing the security landscape of the country, I think the picture is different. I suppose that the Islamic Republic is in need of some sort of legitimacy tool. I mean, it needs either a kind of let's say threat of an adversary or a kind of a success story to get out of this legitimacy crisis that they have. I mean, they either need a kind of heightened Israeli or U.S. threat that gather people around and push them into the mobilization process for voting or whatever, or they want to show that they have to show that they are functional and they're a kind of a functional system that is working well and then can defeat U.S. Reaching to a deal at this moment for the leadership in Iran is the second story. I mean, they see that as a kind of a success story before election, which is probably giving rise to their legitimacy. It can in somehow mobilize parts of the population and brings them to the voting. And also, I see what's Khamenei after. I mean, his reaction to the Zarif leak supporting this analysis. His point was that the final decision, the nuclear cycle decision, or whatever key issue on foreign policy is decided by the leadership. So basically, it's not a reformist or a hardliner or a conservative, let's say, success story. It's the Islamic Republic's success. So that narrative, if deal arrives, that's the Islamic Republic's success. So I think the leadership in Iran is viewing the picture in a way that once a kind of a deal, I mean, that could be, as I said, a kind of a transitory, let's say, less for less deal that Iranians somehow keep part of their nuclear capabilities that they have arrived in post 2019, while the part of the U.S. sanction remain in place, like that one of the RGC, and then they move to the next stage, or a kind of a full return to the JCPOA. On the issue of a kind of a broader deal or a kind of a longer deal, I think that we enter to a more complex story that I will get back to that. And I think at least before election, the dynamic of the election is very much not supporting a kind of a deal that includes broader regional issues.
If I could just add one point to what Abdolrasool said. I'm just wondering, from the point of view of the supreme leader, if it's in his interest to have a deal after the elections. Because as we saw last time in 2015, he kind of played the role of kind of skeptic, standing back and saying, I don't trust the Americans. If you want to do this, fine, but I don't trust them. And then he was able to, say that he was vindicated and use this as a cudgel against the president. And there's always this tension between the president and supreme leader. So I'm wondering if it's in his interest to have the deal done by a new president, even if it's a hardliner. Let's face it, the last time the IRGC, the head of the IRGC in 2015 expressed his reservations about the deal, but then apparently got a memo from the supreme leader and accepted the deal. So even if you have a hardliner as president, as many people are expecting, a former IRGC officer or general, he'll probably have to accept the idea of signing on to a deal, so to speak. But then the supreme leader will be able to say, I am still skeptical, but we will go forward with this. But this could be, again, a source of leverage and a cudgel to be used against the presidency and the executive branch in their inevitable struggle and the inevitable tensions between them that will come about.
Alex, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, to Michael's point about where Khamenei is coming from, look, the man has been there for 32 years. I challenge anyone to go and see how often he comes out and predicts something or claims something to be close to his heart till he knows what the outcome is. In other words, he will always sit on the fence till he knows that, he's not going to be embarrassed. He did that in 2015. I mean, he famously said, we all remember before the sort of deal, he was talking about heroic flexibility. Everyone knew what heroic flexibility meant. That meant go and talk to the Americans, get these sanctions lifted. Now, it didn't turn out to work out the way he had hoped to see. But that's his problem, because I think Michael himself mentioned all these other issues that are in the way of Iran becoming, if you will, quote unquote, normal. Michael mentioned the banking sector. That's just one aspect. There are so many different things that Khamenei himself single-handedly could order to be done differently, policies that could change, that would bring Iran forward to a point where Iran could become normal and accepted and all the rest of it. But Khamenei doesn't do that. And instead of admitting and accepting responsibility, what he does is, he comes out and gives a speech and he says, oh, well, I was suspicious of the Americans. I've always been suspicious. And in the meantime, he forgets about all the things he could have done or did to undermine, the path of talks or the role he, for example, played in undermining the 2015 nuclear deal.
Abdolrasool, did you want to add something here?
Yeah, a very short reaction to the point of Michael. I mean, I agree. There could be one possibility that Khamenei looks somehow a deal after the election. But the Islamic Republic always been this way, that the voting for it is a very important propaganda machine, and it's a very important propaganda tool. So that's a moment that a kind of a people comes to unite with the state, and that's a critical moment of legitimacy for the statehood as a republic. So that's I think quite strategic in the mind of Khamenei, and that's under attack now, under pressure. I may say we shouldn't forget that the polling turnout in the parliamentary election was so low, and that was a huge issue. I mean, also in the streets of Tehran, people are worried not just because of the economic issues only, but the trust over the functioning of the state is low. So having a very good deal before the election time and bringing people to vote, and that's a very a useful moment of bringing back that legitimacy. I think that is something that probably, if Khamenei can manage the gains for the hardliners from this process, could be a possible scenario. I mean, just today, the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, was making a speech, and it was interesting from the sense that he was arguing the fact that the act that they made 2 months ago over the let's say limitations of additional protocol. I mean, the monitoring and of the IAEA over Iran's nuclear program was a very important leverage over the negotiation. So the players are taking a position in a way that it seems that everyone is a kind of a winner here, from hardliners to the reformists. So everyone can take part of that success, and that is at the end of the day is written with the name of the Islamic Republic, and that's, I think, what Khamenei is looking for.
We're running a bit short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to do a kind of quick round robin question for all three of you, trying to nail you down on your predictions. Do you think a deal can be reached? What will it look like, and what happens if it can't? And maybe let's start with you, Alex, and then Abdolrasool, and then conclude with you, Mike.
Alistair, I think, all the signs tell us that a deal will be reached. Unfortunately, for the people of Iran, for the people of Middle East and the rest of the world, it will be one of those short-term tactical deals. It won't deal with some of the key issues that need to be dealt with. But I agree with what Michael also said before, that the Iranian regime right now feels that what it's doing in the region is working for it. So why change course? Which takes us to the heart of this issue. You can only find a lasting solution to the Islamic Republic of Iran's problems of the world if you broaden the conversation to include non-nuclear matters. We're not there yet, but we need to get in that direction if we want to be looking for sustainable agreements. And for that to happen, you need a heck of a lot more political confidence by the parties when they're negotiating with each other. What they're doing right now is best buying time. This is not the type of deal that anyone should bank on to last forever and ever, because unfortunately, as of today, the political confidence is lacking. So, but I think to revive what's left of the JCPOA from 2015, yes, we can expect that to happen in the near future.
Abdolrasool, how about you?
I agree with Alex. I mean, I'm also kind of positive about a kind of a deal. I'm not sure what will be the format of that deal, but a kind of agreement over nuclear issue. But I'm more concerned, about the long-term sustainability of such a deal, mainly for the next government. If the sanction relief will not be efficient as the way the Iranian wants. A conservative government in Tehran can be a kind of a problem in the way that it can react. So, there are certain issues over sustainability of the deal in future. But also, I think that this is a positive move and a step. And if it's accompanied with a number of de-escalatory dynamics like regional talks, but what is happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's happening with a kind of a broader strategy to how to wipe away this asymmetrical nature of Iran's defense policy. I think at the end of the day, we may arrive to a point that could little by little bring Iran back to the normal player.
And it's hard to really find fault with the comments by Alex and Abdolrasool. I agree with a lot of what they said. I tend to kind of suspect there will be a deal. And I also agree that the question is then how long will it last? If you have Republican administration again in another 4 years, or in Iran, if the deal is not extended long term, I mean, I think eventually, as I mentioned before, you only defer to crisis. You kick the can down the road. And then eventually, if the Islamic Republic does not change in its policies and it starts building up its nuclear civilian infrastructure as allowed by the JCPOA, I think in the end, the United States might be inclined, of course, it depends who's in power at that time, to pull out of the JCPOA, just as we pulled out of other agreements, in this case, treaties, ABM treaty, INF, due to things that we said the other people were doing or because the treaty no longer served our interest. Now, if there's no deal, I'm not quite sure where things go. We saw with the Arab-Israeli peace process that you could have processes without deals for a very long time. I just think that because of the dynamic on the ground with Iran's constant building up of enriched material and the like, you don't have the luxury of a prolonged kind of process. Now, one thing that's kind of one bit of change on the horizon is we might see a new Israeli government soon, and there'll be a new head of the Mossad next month. How that affects dynamics, Israeli willingness to accept risk in order to act against Iran if there is no deal, we don't know. So that's just one other additional uncertainty to kind of throw into the hopper.
We'll have to leave it there for now, but Alex, Abdolrasool, Mike, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks all.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.